My name is Priya. I'm 29 years old, and 2 nights before my wedding, my future mother-in-law stood up at our rehearsal dinner in front of 60 guests from both families and played a recording of a private phone call between me and my fiancé, a call she had no legal right to record and had been secretly capturing for 8 months. She wanted to humiliate me in front of everyone I loved. What she didn't know was that I'd found out about the recordings 3 weeks earlier, and I'd spent those 3 weeks building something of my own. Before I tell you what happened next, I want to take you back to the beginning, because the 8 months of secret recordings only make sense once you understand exactly who Carol Whitfield is, and exactly how long she'd been trying to end my engagement to her son. If you're the kind of person who needs to know how this ends before you can breathe normally again, subscribe now, because I post stories like this twice a day, and the comment section on the last one was honestly better than the story itself. Okay, let's go back to the beginning. How I met Adam. I met Adam Whitfield 3 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in Portland, Oregon, where we both still live. He was 31, an architect at a mid-sized firm downtown, quiet in the specific, observant way that I've come to understand means someone is actually listening rather than waiting for their turn to talk. He'd brought a bottle of wine that nobody else at the dinner particularly cared about, but that he'd clearly researched carefully, and when I asked him about it, he spent 10 minutes explaining the specific soil composition of the region it came from with an earnestness that I found immediately and helplessly charming. We started dating 2 months later, and within a year, I knew I wanted to marry him, not because of any single dramatic moment, but because of the steady accumulation of small ones, the kind that build a life rather than just a relationship. He remembered things. He noticed when I was tired before I said so. He once spent an entire Saturday helping me reorganize the medication storage system in my apartment's first aid kit because I'd mentioned, in passing, that the disorganization of it bothered me more than I let on, and I came home from a shift to find every bottle alphabetized and labeled in his careful architect's handwriting. I want to tell you about Adam's family before I tell you anything else, because his mother, Carol, is the entire reason this story exists, and I don't think you can understand what she eventually did without understanding who she'd always been. Carol Whitfield is 61 years old, widowed 11 years ago when Adam's father, Daniel, died of a sudden heart attack at 53, 2 weeks after his retirement party, a detail that I think explains more about Carol than almost anything else in this story. She had spent 30 years planning a particular version of the rest of her life: travel, grandchildren, a husband finally home and present after decades of long work hours, and all of it collapsed in a single afternoon. She has spent every year since pouring the full force of her attention into her only son. I don't say that as an exaggeration. Adam has a younger sister, Maddie, who lives in Seattle and has, by her own admission, spent most of her adult life quietly relieved that Carol's intensity gets directed almost entirely at her brother rather than at her. Maddie told me, early in my relationship with Adam, in the careful, slightly apologetic tone of someone warning you about whether you can avoid, Mom decided a long time ago that Adam was the one who needed her. I think it's because he was closer to Dad, honestly. I think some part of her thinks if she just holds on tight enough to Adam, it's like holding on to a piece of Dad too. Carol calls Adam every single day. Not occasionally, not when something specific comes up. Every day, sometimes twice, with the easy, unquestioned regularity of a habit nobody in the family had ever successfully challenged. She has opinions about his apartment, his job, his diet, his friendships, and once we started dating, about me, expressed not always directly to my face, but constantly, persistently, to Adam, in conversations I only ever heard secondhand, filtered through whatever version he was willing to share. I met Carol for the first time about 4 months into dating Adam, at a dinner she organized at her house, and I want to describe that first dinner carefully, because the entire architecture of what came later was already visible in it, if I'd known to look for it. The first dinner. Carol's house was immaculate in the specific way that houses become immaculate when someone has too much time and too much unspent attention. Every surface dusted, every cushion arranged with geometric precision, photographs of Adam arranged on the mantel in a deliberate chronology from infancy through his architecture school graduation, with noticeably fewer photographs of Maddie scattered among them. She was warm to me in the specific, performative way that I'd later learn was her default mode with anyone she hadn't yet decided whether to fully accept. She asked about my family. My parents immigrated from Mumbai before I was born and run a small but successful chain of pharmacies in the Portland area, which is actually how I first developed my interest in pharmacy as a career, and complimented the wine I'd brought, generously and a little too enthusiastically, the way you compliment something you've already decided not to actually drink. I work as a clinical pharmacist at a hospital in downtown Portland, a job that requires the kind of total, unforgiving precision that doesn't leave much room for guesswork, and I remember explaining this to Carol that first night, watching her nod along with polite, glazed interest before redirecting, smoothly, to ask Adam about a project at his firm. But underneath all of it, I noticed something I couldn't quite name yet, a particular way she watched Adam when he spoke to me, the way you'd watch something you were worried was slipping out of your hands. At one point, when Adam reached across the table to refill my water glass before his own, I caught Carol's expression in the half-second before she rearranged it into something neutral, and what I saw, just for that flash, was something closer to grief than annoyance, as though she were watching a small, specific piece of her son's attention get redirected somewhere she could no longer follow it. Drop a comment right now if you've ever met a partner's parent and immediately felt something off that you couldn't name yet, because I think almost everyone watching this has had that exact moment, and I want to know how long it took you to figure out what it actually was. The slow campaign. I want to walk through the 2 years between that first dinner and our engagement, because Carol's behavior didn't arrive all at once. It built, slowly, the way these things almost always build, in small comments, in subtle redirections, in 100 tiny moments that each, individually, could be dismissed as nothing, but that together formed a pattern I eventually couldn't ignore. About 6 months into the relationship, Carol started a habit she maintained for the rest of our courtship, calling Adam immediately after every time the three of us spent time together, sometimes within minutes of us leaving her house. Adam mentioned this to me casually at first, almost as a funny quirk. My mom already called. She wants to know what you thought of the lasagna. But over time, I started noticing that these calls weren't really about lasagna. They were debriefs. Carol wanted a full accounting of every interaction, every word I'd said, every reaction I'd had, processed and reported back to her in real time. I asked Adam about it once, gently, about a year in. He got defensive, in the specific way people get defensive about a parent they already half know is behaving strangely but aren't ready to fully examine. "She's just close to me," he said. "She lost my dad. I'm all she has." I let it go because I understood genuinely that grief reshapes people, and I didn't want to be the partner who couldn't make room for that. But the comments kept accumulating. Carol mentioned, more than once, in front of me, that she'd always pictured Adam marrying someone more like family, a phrase she never fully explained, but that I understood every time she said it, was not actually about me specifically. It was about anyone who wasn't her. At a holiday dinner about 18 months in, she told a story, to the whole table, about a woman Adam had dated briefly in college named Bethany, who Carol described as perfect for him. Honestly, I never understood why that one didn't work out. A comment delivered with a small, pointed glance in my direction that nobody else at the table seemed to register, but that landed on me with total clarity. Later that night, in the car, Adam told me, almost apologetically, that Bethany had actually broken up with him after a single semester because, in Adam's own words, she said my mom called too much and I didn't really argue with her about it, because she wasn't wrong. I want to give you one more example because I think the accumulation matters more than any single instance. About 2 years into the relationship, 6 months before the engagement, Carol started a tradition of sending Adam articles, long, detailed, carefully selected articles about red flags to watch for in relationships, about the importance of not rushing into marriage, about statistics on divorce rates among couples who married before age 32. Adam was 31 at the time. He showed me a few of these texts once, half laughing, treating it as an eccentric habit rather than what I now understand it actually was, a sustained, deliberate campaign conducted in plain sight, disguised as motherly concern. I want to be fair to Carol here, the way I've tried to be fair to every difficult person in this story before I get to the part where fairness becomes harder to extend. I don't think Carol set out, consciously, to be cruel. I think Carol is a woman who lost her husband suddenly, who built her entire identity around being needed by her son, and who experienced every step of our relationship, the dating, the moving in together, eventually the engagement, as a slow, terrifying erosion of the one role she had left. I understand that. I even, for a long time, had genuine sympathy for it. What I didn't understand, until much later, was exactly how far she was willing to go to stop it. The engagement. Adam proposed 2 years into the relationship on a hiking trail outside Portland that had become, over time, a place that meant something specific to the two of us. The trail we'd hiked on our third date, soaked from unexpected rain, laughing the entire way back to the car because neither of us had brought a real jacket, and we'd ended up sharing the one windbreaker Adam had stuffed into his backpack. He'd planned the proposal carefully, a specific overlook, a ring he'd had custom designed using a small sapphire that had belonged to his own grandmother, a speech he'd clearly rehearsed and still stumbled through anyway, which somehow made it better. It was genuinely one of the best days of my life. Carol's reaction, when Adam told her, was complicated in a way I only learned about much later, secondhand, from Maddie, who eventually became one of my closest allies in this entire situation. According to Maddie, Carol cried on the phone with Adam. Not happy tears, though she performed enough of those when she called me directly the next day to congratulate me, her voice pitched in a register of joy that I now understand was almost entirely manufactured. The real reaction, the one she gave Maddie privately, was different. "I just don't understand why he's rushing this," Carol reportedly said. "He hasn't even known her that long. I don't think she's right for him, and I don't think anyone in this family actually feels comfortable saying that out loud except me." I didn't know about that conversation at the time. What I experienced, in the months following the engagement, was Carol becoming more involved in wedding planning than either Adam or I had asked her to be, inserting herself into vendor decisions, questioning guest list choices, suggesting, more than once, that certain elements of the wedding should probably reflect the Whitfield side more, since that's the family with the actual history in Portland. A comment that conveniently ignored that my own family had lived in the Portland metro area for over 25 years. I let most of it go, because wedding planning with a controlling mother-in-law is, I told myself, a fairly ordinary problem that countless other brides had survived before me. What I didn't yet know was that Carol had decided, somewhere in those early months of engagement, that ordinary objections weren't going to be enough to stop the wedding. She needed something more concrete. Something she could use. The discovery. I found out about the recordings 3 weeks before the wedding, almost entirely by accident, in a way that still strikes me, looking back, as the kind of small, mundane coincidence that ends up changing everything. Adam had left his phone charging at my apartment one evening while we cooked dinner together, and it buzzed repeatedly with a notification I wasn't trying to see but couldn't help noticing, given that the phone was sitting face up on the counter beside the cutting board. The notification was from a call recording app, one I didn't recognize, with a name I'd never seen before, syncing a backup to a cloud account. I want to be honest that my first instinct wasn't suspicion. It was confusion. I asked Adam, casually, what the app was, assuming it was something work-related, some architecture firm tool for recording client calls. He glanced at the notification, and I watched something shift in his face, a small, fast recalibration that I'd later come to recognize as the specific look of someone realizing, in real time, that something they'd been avoiding thinking about had just surfaced without warning. "That's weird," he said. "I don't have that app." We looked at it together. It was, in fact, an app he didn't have, but it was syncing to a cloud account linked to an email address that, when we checked it more carefully, turned out to be one digit off from his own personal email, registered under a name that combined his middle name with a string of numbers. It took us almost 20 minutes of increasingly uneasy investigation to understand what we were actually looking at. A call recording application had been installed on Adam's phone, almost certainly during a visit to Carol's house a few months earlier, when he'd left his phone unattended on her kitchen counter for the better part of an evening while helping her move furniture in another room. A visit I remembered specifically because I hadn't gone, having worked a long hospital shift that day, and Adam had gone alone, staying late into the evening. I want to walk through exactly what we found, because the specifics matter enormously to what happened next. The app had been recording select phone calls, Not all of them, which made it clear someone had configured it deliberately rather than letting it run indiscriminately, capturing specifically the calls between Adam and me, going back roughly 8 months. 8 months of conversations, recorded without my knowledge or consent, backed up to a cloud account that, once we dug deeper into the account's recovery email and a linked phone number, traced unmistakably back to Carol. The recovery phone number was the same one she'd used to call Adam every single day for years, the number we both had memorized without even trying. I sat on my kitchen floor that night, the same way I'd later realize that so many people in stories like this one end up sitting on kitchen floors when the floor of their life suddenly tilts, and try to process what it meant that my future mother-in-law had spent 8 months secretly recording private conversations between me and the man I was about to marry. What was actually in the recordings? I want to be honest about something here because I think it's important to the integrity of this story. I had said things across those 8 months of recorded calls that I would not have wanted Carol to hear. Not anything cruel, and certainly nothing untrue, but private venting, the ordinary, unguarded complaints that every engaged person eventually voices to their partner about a difficult future-in-law. I told Adam, more than once, that his mother's constant calls felt suffocating. I told him I was tired of her inserting herself into wedding decisions. I told him, once, in a moment of genuine frustration after a particularly difficult planning call about whether we should use a specific florist Carol's friend recommended, that I sometimes wondered if Carol would ever actually let him have his own life. None of that was secret information, exactly. Adam knew I felt all of it because I'd told him directly the same things I'd said on those calls. But there's a difference between telling your fiancé something privately and having your future mother-in-law possess a recorded, time-stamped, replayable version of you saying it, available to be played back at a moment of her choosing, stripped of all the context and tenderness that surrounded it in the actual relationship. I understood immediately, sitting on that kitchen floor, exactly what Carol intended to do with 8 months of recordings, even before I had any concrete evidence of a specific plan. She wasn't collecting them for nothing. She was building a case, the same way you'd build a case against someone in court, methodically gathering evidence over time, waiting for the moment it would do the most damage. I want to ask you something right here, because I think this is one of the most important questions in this entire story. If you discovered, 3 weeks before your own wedding, that your future mother-in-law had been secretly recording your private calls for 8 months, what would your very first instinct have been? Confrontation? Calling off the wedding? Going straight to your fiancé? I want you to actually think about your honest answer before I tell you what I did, because I think most people's instinct is very different from what I actually chose. The decision not to confront her immediately. Adam wanted to call his mother that same night and confront her directly. I understand why. It was his mother, his trust that had been violated alongside mine, his sense of family loyalty now colliding head-on with the discovery that the person who'd raised him had been spying on his relationship for 8 months. He paced my small kitchen for almost an hour, phone in hand, his thumb hovering over her contact name, and I watched him cycle through versions of the call he wanted to make, each one angrier than the last. But I asked him, that night, to wait, and I want to explain exactly why, because I think the reasoning matters more than the eventual confrontation itself. I told him that if we confronted Carol privately, immediately, with no plan beyond raw anger, she would have every opportunity to do what people like Carol always do when caught: minimize, deflect, reframe herself as the wounded party rather than the violator. She would cry. She would say she was scared of losing her son. She would, I predicted, somehow turn the conversation into one about her grief rather than her actions. And 3 weeks before a wedding, with both families already deep into the logistics of a major event, I knew Adam would feel enormous pressure to let her off easily, to smooth things over for the sake of keeping the peace before the ceremony. I told him I needed time to think clearly about what I actually wanted out of this. Not revenge, exactly, but some way to ensure that Carol understood completely and undeniably the actual scope of what she'd done, in a way she couldn't talk her way around afterward. I spent the following few days doing something I think surprised even myself. I didn't get angrier. I got methodical. I am, by training, someone who works in a hospital pharmacy, cross-referencing medication interactions, dosages, patient histories, Work that requires total precision, because a single error has real consequences for a real person. I applied that same precision to the situation in front of me. I asked Adam, carefully, to help me access the full scope of what had been recorded, not to listen to all 8 months of it, which felt invasive even toward myself, but to understand the shape and timeline of it. We found that the recordings spanned almost exactly the period from a few months before our engagement through the present, which told me something important. Carol hadn't started recording randomly. She'd started, as best we could tell, shortly after Adam first mentioned to her in a phone call that he was thinking about proposing. The recordings weren't a general surveillance habit. They were a specific, targeted response to the exact moment she'd realized this relationship was becoming permanent. Building something of my own. I want to walk through exactly what I did over the following 3 weeks, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters most, more than the eventual confrontation, more than the satisfying reveal. The preparation is the real story. I consulted, quietly, with a friend from pharmacy school named Renata, who'd gone on to law school and now practiced family and privacy law in Portland. I wanted to understand, clearly, what Carol had actually done legally before I decided how to respond to it. Renata and I met at a coffee shop near the hospital during my lunch break, and I remember her face as I laid out what we'd found. The specific, professional stillness of someone listening to a problem they immediately recognize the shape of. She explained that Oregon, like many states, has what's called an all-party consent law for recorded communications, meaning that recording a phone call without the knowledge and consent of every party on that call is illegal, not just ethically questionable, but a genuine violation of state wiretapping statutes, with both civil and potential criminal consequences, depending on how the recordings were used. She told me the statute specifically, Oregon Revised Statute 165.540, and explained that violations could constitute a Class A misdemeanor, and that if the recordings were used to cause harm, say, played publicly to damage someone's reputation or relationships, that could potentially support additional civil claims. I want to be honest that I did not, at any point in this process, want to send Carol to jail. That was never the goal. But understanding clearly that what she'd done wasn't simply an overbearing mother's lapse in judgment, but an actual violation of the law, changed how I approached everything that followed. It meant I wasn't walking into this situation as someone who'd been merely embarrassed. I was walking in as someone who had genuine legal standing, real leverage, and the calm, documented knowledge that I held it. I asked Renata to help me draft a simple, factual summary of exactly what had been found. The app, the cloud account, the linked email, the timeline, the relevant state statute, not as a legal filing but as a document I could have ready, just in case I ever needed to present the facts clearly and undeniably, in writing, to anyone who needed to see them. She also gave me something I hadn't fully considered, a clear explanation of exactly what I myself was and wasn't legally permitted to do in response, which became important almost immediately. And then I did something else, something I think is the actual turning point of this entire story, the part that I suspect most people listening haven't guessed yet. I started recording my own conversations with Carol. Legally, deliberately, and with full knowledge on my part of exactly what I was doing and why. I want to explain this carefully because I think it's important not to misunderstand it as simple hypocrisy. Under Oregon law, a person can legally record a conversation they themselves are a participant in, as long as they have at least one party's consent, meaning my own consent, since I was on the call, was sufficient under the law, even without Carol knowing. This is fundamentally different from what Carol had done, which was recording calls she wasn't even part of, between 2 other people, without anyone's knowledge. Over the following 2.5 weeks, in 3 separate phone calls with Carol, calls about final wedding logistics, calls that, on the surface, were about seating charts and rehearsal dinner timing, I asked her a series of careful, specific, seemingly innocuous questions. Questions about how she felt about the wedding. Questions about whether she had any concerns about me, about Adam's choice, about the marriage going forward. I want to be honest that this required a particular kind of discipline I'm not sure I'd ever exercised before in my life. Staying calm, staying warm, staying exactly as friendly and engaged as I'd always been with her, while quietly, legally, recording every word, my own phone propped against a glass of water on my kitchen counter, the recording app open and running while I discussed table linens in a voice that gave nothing away. The first of the three calls was almost entirely unremarkable, a genuine conversation about seating arrangements, where Carol was warm and engaged in exactly the way she usually was when discussing logistics she felt some control over. I almost gave up on the entire approach after that call, wondering if I'd misjudged the situation, if perhaps Carol's recordings had been some strange, isolated lapse rather than part of a larger plan. The second call changed that. We were discussing the rehearsal dinner seating arrangement, a fairly mundane logistical conversation, when Carol said, almost in passing, in the same tone she might have used to mention the weather, "I just think it's important that people understand, before the wedding, what kind of person Adam is actually marrying. I don't think she's been honest about how she really feels about this family." I felt my pulse quicken, but I kept my voice level. "What do you mean by that, Carol?" "I think there are things she said, privately, that would change how people see this whole situation if they knew about them," Carol said. I asked, with genuine, careful neutrality in my voice, how she would know what I'd said privately. There was a pause, a small, telling pause, before she said, "A mother knows things. I just have a feeling about people." I let that sit, and then redirected the conversation back to napkin colors, my heart pounding the entire time, and hung up the call feeling for the first time since the discovery that I finally had something real. The third call. In the third call, 4 days before the wedding, she said something even more direct, something I will share because I think it's the single sentence that made everything afterward not just justified, but necessary. We were discussing the rehearsal dinner toast order, and I'd asked her, casually, if she had anything specific she wanted to say in her toast. "I think, honestly," she said, "that some people need to hear the truth before they walk down an aisle they shouldn't be walking down. I think it would be doing Adam a favor, honestly, if certain things came out before Saturday instead of after." "What kind of things, Carol?" I asked, my voice carefully steady. "You'll see," she said, and there was something almost satisfied in her tone, the specific satisfaction of someone who believes they're about to win something. "I think everyone deserves to know the truth before this wedding happens. I think it's the loving thing to do, even if it's hard." I had, by that point, more than enough. Not just evidence that Carol had recorded us, which I already had from the discovery itself, but a clear, recorded admission that she intended to use private information against me, specifically timed before the wedding, specifically designed to derail it. I called Renata that same night and read her the relevant portion of the call. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Priya, I think you need to prepare for the possibility that she's actually going to do this publicly. I think you need a plan that isn't just defensive." That conversation is when the actual plan for the rehearsal dinner started to take shape, not improvised in the moment, but built, deliberately, days in advance, with Adam fully included in every part of it. Preparing Adam, and preparing myself. I want to tell you about the conversation Adam and I had after I played him that third recording because I think it's important to understanding why what happened at the rehearsal dinner unfolded the way it did, rather than collapsing into chaos. Adam listened to the recording twice, sitting very still on my couch, his hands pressed flat against his knees. When it finished the second time, he didn't say anything for almost a full minute. Then he said, quietly, "She's actually going to do this. At the rehearsal dinner. In front of everyone." "I think so," I said. "I think that's exactly what she's planning." He asked me what I wanted to do. I told him the truth, that I didn't want to preemptively confront her and give her the chance to either back down and regroup for some other moment, or escalate into something even more dramatic out of panic. I wanted to let her walk into the room believing she held all the leverage, and then show her, calmly and completely, that she didn't. I want to be honest that this required something from Adam that I think is genuinely difficult for any adult child to give, a willingness to let his own mother walk into a public humiliation of her own making, without warning her in advance, without softening the blow, without protecting her from the consequences of a plan she'd built herself. He struggled with this for 2 full days. He told me at one point that some part of him kept wanting to just call her and beg her not to do whatever she was planning, to skip the entire confrontation and just get through the wedding peacefully. I told him I understood that instinct completely, and that if he genuinely wanted to handle it that way, I would respect it, even though I believed it would mean Carol never fully understood the weight of what she'd done, and would likely try something similar again at some future point in our marriage, at a christening, at a holiday, at any moment she felt her position threatened. Adam thought about it for another full day, and then he came to me and said, I don't want to spend the rest of our marriage wondering when she's going to do something like this again. I want her to understand, completely, in a way she can't argue around, exactly what she did. I'll support whatever you decide to do at that dinner. We spent the final days before the rehearsal dinner not panicking but preparing, almost the way I imagine attorneys prepare for a case, walking through different scenarios, different things Carol might say, different ways the room might react, making sure that whatever happened, I would be ready, and Adam would be standing beside me rather than caught flat-footed in the middle. The rehearsal dinner. The rehearsal dinner was held at a private event space downtown, a warm, softly lit room with about 60 guests, both families, the wedding party, a handful of close friends. It was meant to be a celebration, the calm, joyful evening before the actual wedding day. The room smelled like the roses in the centerpieces and the specific, slightly smoky scent of the restaurant's open kitchen. My parents sat near the front, my father in the navy suit he'd worn to every important event of my life, looking genuinely happy in a way that made the entire situation feel even more precarious, because I knew what was coming and he didn't. We were partway through the dinner. After the toasts had mostly concluded, Adam's best man had given a warm, funny speech. My own sister had cried through hers in the specific way that made everyone else cry too, when Carol stood up, glass in hand, with a specific, deliberate posture of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. I'd like to say something, she said, and the room quieted the way rooms do for a parent's toast, expecting warmth, expecting tears, expecting the ordinary, lovely things mothers say the night before their children marry. What she said instead was this: I love my son. And because I love him, I think there are things people in this room deserve to know before tomorrow. She held up her phone. I've recorded some conversations over the past several months, and I think it's important that everyone hear what Priya really thinks about this family in her own words before this wedding happens. I want to describe the room in that exact moment, because the texture of it matters. There was a beat of stunned, confused silence. Most of the 60 guests hadn't yet processed what was actually being announced, still operating under the assumption that this was some unusual, but ultimately harmless toast. Adam's sister Maddie's face went rigid. My own mother, sitting 2 tables away, looked at me with an expression of pure, rising alarm. My father's hand found my mother's arm under the table. Carol pressed play on a short clip, maybe 15 seconds, of my own voice, pulled from one of those 8 months of recordings, saying something about feeling suffocated by how often she called, edited, I noted immediately, to cut off the surrounding context that would have shown it was a single moment of frustration inside an otherwise warm and ordinary conversation about wedding planning logistics. The room went completely silent. I felt 60 pairs of eyes shift toward me, waiting to see what I would do. I stood up. What I said, and what I played. I want to thank Carol for bringing this up, I said, and I want you to understand that my voice did not shake because I had been preparing, in some sense, for exactly this moment for 3 weeks. Because I have something I'd like to play too. I want every single person reading this to imagine, for a second, the specific look on Carol's face in that exact moment. The confident, prepared woman who just played her one piece of leverage, suddenly realizing, in real time, that the person she'd ambushed had walked in with leverage of her own. Comment below right now, and guess what you think happened to her expression, because I promise you, the actual reaction was even more dramatic than whatever you're imagining. I took out my own phone. Before I play this, I said, I want to be clear about something for the record, in front of everyone here. What Carol just did, recording private phone calls between me and Adam without our knowledge, for 8 months, then playing them publicly, is not just a betrayal of trust. It's illegal under Oregon law. Recording a conversation you're not even a participant in, without consent from anyone on the call, is a wiretapping violation under Oregon Revised Statute 165.540. I have documentation of that prepared by an attorney, ready to be filed if it ever needs to be. I let that land for a moment. Carol's face had already started to change. the confident posture from a minute earlier visibly draining out of her, her hand, still holding her own phone, slowly lowering to the table. What I'm about to play is different, I continued. These are recordings of conversations I had directly with Carol, where I was a participant on the call. Under Oregon law, that's completely legal because I only need my own consent to record a call I'm part of. I recorded 3 conversations with Carol over the past 2.5 weeks, after I discovered what she'd been doing to us for 8 months. I want everyone here to hear exactly what she said, in her own words, about her plans for tonight. I played the clip from the 3rd call, the one where she said, plainly, that she thought certain things should come out before Saturday instead of after, that it would be doing Adam a favor to derail his own wedding using private information she'd illegally gathered. I had queued it up precisely, the exact 15 seconds that mattered most, and I'd practiced alone in my apartment 2 nights earlier, exactly how to hold my phone so the audio would carry clearly across a room. The room, if it had been silent before, became something closer to frozen. I watched Carol's face go through the exact same transformation I'd watched happen to people in countless smaller confrontations across my life. Confidence, then confusion, then the specific, sinking recognition of someone realizing they have been completely, fundamentally outmaneuvered by a person they badly underestimated. Adam's uncle Frank, Carol's own brother-in-law, who'd flown in from Arizona for the wedding, said, into the silence, "Carol, you recorded their private calls? For 8 months." Carol didn't answer immediately. My own mother, beside me, had her hand pressed flat against her chest, the specific gesture she makes when she's trying not to cry in public. Maddie, Adam's sister, had her face in her hands, and when she looked up, I saw that she was crying. Not from shock, I realized later, but from something closer to vindication, a decade of watching her mother's intensity directed at her brother finally, undeniably, surfacing into something everyone else could see too. I want to be clear, I said into the silence, that I'm not playing this to humiliate Carol in front of everyone, even though I understand that's exactly what's happening right now, because she chose to make this public first. I'm playing it because I refuse to let a wedding, my wedding, 2 days from now, start with a lie about who actually violated trust in this family. Carol decided tonight was the night to make this a public matter. So now it's public, on both sides completely. What happened in the room after? Carol sat down. I want to be honest and tell you that she did not collapse dramatically, did not cry immediately, did not storm out. What happened was quieter and, in its own way, more complete. She sat, her face pale, and said nothing for what felt like a very long time, while 60 guests sat in the kind of charged silence that exists after something true and uncomfortable has been said out loud in a room that was supposed to be celebrating something else entirely. Adam stood up next to me. He hadn't known until that exact moment that I was actually going to play the recording. We'd discussed the possibility, prepared for it, but I told him I wanted to make the final call myself, in the moment, depending on what Carol actually did. He put his hand briefly on my shoulder and then turned to address the room directly. I want everyone to know, he said, that everything Priya just said is true. I found out 3 weeks ago that my mother had secretly recorded 8 months of private calls between me and my fiancé. I've known about Priya's recordings of my mother for the past 2 weeks. We talked about this together, extensively, before deciding how to handle it. I love my mother. I also love Priya, and I am marrying her in 2 days, and I am deeply, deeply sorry that my mother chose tonight, of all nights, to try to make that not happen. He turned to Carol.
Mom,
I need you to understand something clearly. What you did was not protective. It wasn't love, even if some part of you genuinely believes it was. It was a violation of both of us, sustained for 8 months, and then weaponized publicly, in the cruelest possible way, in front of every person who matters to us. I need you to sit with that, because I'm not going to pretend, for your comfort, that what just happened was anything other than exactly what it was. I watched Carol's face while he spoke, and I want to describe, honestly, what I saw there because I think it matters. It wasn't pure shame, not yet. There was a flicker, briefly, of something closer to wounded defensiveness, the start of a sentence I could see forming behind her eyes, some version of, "I was only trying to protect you," before she seemed to understand, looking around the room at 60 faces, none of them offering her the sympathy that defense usually earned her, that the sentence wasn't going to land the way it always had before. The rest of the dinner, and the 2 days that followed. I want to be honest that the rest of the dinner did not simply return to celebration. There is a particular, heavy weight that settles over a room after something this true and uncomfortable has happened in front of everyone, and that weight didn't lift simply because the band kept playing and the dessert course arrived on schedule. The conversation at most tables stayed quieter than it had been before the toast, people speaking in a slightly subdued register of guests who've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to see. Carol left early, alone, without saying goodbye to most of the guests. Adam's uncle Frank drove her home. I didn't speak to her again before the wedding, and honestly, I didn't try to. I had decided, days before, that whatever happened at that dinner, I was not going to spend the 48 hours before my wedding managing my future mother-in-law's feelings about a situation she herself had created. What I noticed over the following 2 days was a quiet, steady stream of people from both families finding small, private moments to say something to me. Adam's Aunt Linda squeezed my hand on her way out and said, simply, "I'm glad you didn't just sit there and take it." I've watched Carol do smaller versions of this for years, to other people in this family, and nobody ever pushed back. I think you might have done something good for more people than just yourself tonight. A cousin of Adam's, someone I barely knew, sent me a short, kind text the next morning saying she respected how I'd handled it, that she would have lost her composure completely in my position. My own mother, that night, sat with me in my childhood bedroom. I'd gone back to my parents' house instead of staying alone after the dinner, and asked me, gently, if I was sure I still wanted to go through with the wedding given everything that had just happened. I told her, with complete certainty, that I'd never once doubted Adam, only Carol, and that watching him stand up in that room and say exactly what needed to be said, without hesitation, without trying to soften it for his mother's sake, had actually made me more certain about marrying him, not less. The wedding happened 2 days later, exactly as planned. Carol attended. Adam insisted, despite everything, that he wanted his mother at his wedding, and I respected that decision, even though it cost me something to extend that grace so soon after what had happened. She was quiet throughout the ceremony and reception, polite but withdrawn, clearly still processing the public collapse of a plan she'd spent 8 months building. She did not give a toast at the wedding itself. Nobody asked her to, and she didn't request the opportunity. The conversation, weeks later. Carol and I had our actual private conversation about a month after the wedding, at her request, over coffee, just the two of us. I want to be honest that she did not deliver a complete, unqualified apology in the way that would make for the cleanest possible ending to this story. What she delivered was something more complicated. She told me she had genuinely believed, for most of those 8 months, that she was protecting Adam, that she'd convinced herself, gradually, that recording our calls was simply a way of staying informed about a relationship she felt increasingly shut out of, rather than understanding, clearly, that it was a violation she'd never have tolerated if it had been done to her. She said she didn't fully understand, until she watched the room's reaction at the rehearsal dinner, exactly how far she'd let her own fear take her. "I think," she said, turning her coffee cup slowly the way people do when working up to something difficult, "I built a story where I was the only one who really understood what was best for Adam, and once I believed that story, almost anything I did to protect it felt justified to me. I didn't let myself see what it actually was, because seeing it clearly would have meant admitting I'd become someone I never thought I'd become." She told me, too, something I hadn't fully expected. That part of what drove the recordings wasn't only fear of losing Adam to me specifically, but a deeper, more diffuse terror of losing relevance entirely, of becoming a woman whose only remaining function in her son's life was an occasional phone call he answered out of obligation rather than need. "Your father died," she said, almost to herself, "and I built my whole life around being needed by Adam instead. I don't think I ever stopped to ask whether that was fair to him or healthy for me until I was sitting in that room watching everyone look at me the way they looked at me." I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I meant it. I also told her, honestly, that one coffee conversation didn't undo 8 months of secret recordings and one devastating public ambush, and that I needed real time, not vague promises, but actual, sustained, demonstrated change before I could trust her with anything private again. Where things are now. It's been almost a year since the wedding. Carol's relationship with me and with Adam is different now. Not warm in the easy way some resolution stories promise, but functional, careful, and, I think, genuinely more honest than it was before. She has never asked to be alone with my phone, my calls, or my private conversations with Adam again, and I think some part of her understands completely why that boundary now exists and isn't going anywhere. She has, to her credit, started seeing a therapist, something Maddie told me about, not Carol herself, since Carol still tends to keep her own internal processes private even now. Maddie said it started about 2 months after the wedding, and that she's noticed, in small ways, a difference in how their mother talks about Adam's marriage. Less monitoring, more genuine, if still occasionally clumsy, curiosity about our actual lives rather than a need to be embedded inside every detail of them. Adam and I talk sometimes about what those 3 weeks of quiet preparation actually taught us, both individually and as a couple. He's told me, more than once, that watching me handle that situation, calmly, legally, methodically, without ever once losing my composure in the way Carol clearly expected me to, changed how he thinks about conflict permanently. I've told him, in turn, that I think the hardest part wasn't actually the confrontation itself. It was the 3 weeks of staying warm and ordinary with Carol on the phone while quietly building the exact thing that would eventually dismantle her plan. I want to leave you with a question I keep coming back to myself, because I genuinely want to know where you land on it. Do you think I made the right call, waiting and preparing instead of confronting Carol the very night we found the recordings? Or do you think the 8 months of secret recordings deserved an immediate, furious response, rather than 3 weeks of careful, quiet strategy? I read every single comment, and I am consistently surprised by how differently people answer this. And one more thing I'll ask you before I go, because I think it's the question that actually sits underneath this entire story. Do you think Carol's 8 months of recording came from love, twisted into something destructive by grief and fear? Or do you think calling it love, even a broken version of it, gives her too much credit for something that was, underneath everything, really about control? I genuinely go back and forth on this myself, even now, a year later, and I want to know where you land. That's my story. 8 months of secret recordings, 3 weeks of quiet preparation, and one rehearsal dinner where a woman who thought she held all the leverage in the room found out, in front of 60 guests, that she'd badly, fundamentally underestimated the person she was trying to destroy. If you want more stories like this, subscribe right now. I post twice a day, every single day, and the next one is going to leave you just as stunned as this one did. See you there.